the floodwaters receded on May 15, 1847, leaving behind more than just mud and debris in the basement of the Bender farmhouse. Sheriff Jacob Martinez descended the wooden steps, oil lamp trembling in his grip, only to discover human skulls grinning from beneath rotted floorboards like some macabre garden finally blooming in spring. This wasn't just another frontier tragedy. This was the unraveling of America's first documented family of serial killers, operating in plain sight along Michigan's most traveled trade routes. The morning had started with complaints about the stench. Neighbors walking past the modest clapboard house on the outskirts of Traverse City reported a smell that made grown men retch, something beyond spoiled meat or stagnant water. The Bender family, John, his wife Kate, their son William, and daughter-in-law Sarah had vanished 3 days earlier, leaving behind only their livestock and whatever the flood had exposed. Martinez counted 17 skulls in that first sweep, 17 distinct human remains scattered among farm tools and preserved vegetables like some twisted pantry of death. The basement walls, built from local limestone, had kept their secrets well until the Boardman River overflowed its banks and washed away years of careful concealment. But who were these people? Where had they come from? And how had an entire family turned their homestead into a killing ground without anyone noticing? Before we descend deeper into this nightmare that haunted Michigan's lumber boom, I want to know, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what we're about to uncover has been buried in county records for over a century. The Bender property sat strategically along the Grand Traverse Trail, the main artery connecting fur traders from the Northern Territories to the markets in Detroit and Chicago. Travelers routinely stopped for meals, supplies, or shelter, making the farmhouse a natural way station for men carrying seasons' worth of pelts and gold. Kate Bender ran what locals called a traveler's inn, though no official records exist of licensing or regulation. Guests paid for simple meals of salt, pork, and cornbread, sometimes renting floor space in the main room for the night. The family seemed unremarkable. German immigrants who'd arrived in 1842, speaking broken English and keeping mostly to themselves. From the Traverse City Herald, March 3, 1846. The Bender establishment provides adequate accommodation for traders heading south. Rates reasonable, portions generous. What the newspaper didn't mention was how many of those traders never completed their journey south. How many families back east waited for letters that never came, for husbands and sons who'd simply vanished into Michigan's endless forests. The evidence in that flooded basement told a different story than the one the Benders had been selling to their neighbors. Among the bones, Martinez found personal effects, pocket watches, wedding rings, leather pouches that once held coins. These weren't random victims of disease or accident. These were deliberate murders, systematic and profitable. But the true horror wasn't just in the numbers or the method. Death had a business model. The real question wasn't how the Benders had killed so many people without getting caught. It was how an entire community had chosen not to see what was happening right in front of them. The hammer fell on Wilhelm Schaefer's skull at exactly 9:37 p.m. on October 12, 1846, while he sat enjoying what he thought would be his last meal before reaching Detroit. The sound echoed through the Bender farmhouse like an axe splitting cordwood, final and irreversible. This wasn't random violence. This was a family business operating with the precision of a well-oiled mill, and Schaefer had just become their most profitable victim of the season. The Grand Traverse Trail carried more than just fur traders in 1846. Lumber barons moved fortunes in cash to purchase timber rights. Government surveyors traveled with expensive instruments and federal wages. Prospectors carried gold dust from the newly discovered copper deposits near Eagle River. Each traveler represented potential profit for those willing to take what wasn't freely given. John Bender had chosen his location with the eye of a seasoned predator. The farmhouse sat at the convergence of three major routes: traders coming down from Mackinac Island, lumber crews heading to the Muskegon mills, and government officials traveling between territorial outposts. No single authority monitored this crossroads. No law enforcement patrolled regularly. Travelers simply vanished into Michigan's vast wilderness, and their absence could be explained away as bear attacks, harsh weather, or simple misfortune. The Bender method revealed itself through the positioning of Schaefer's remains. Unlike the other skeletons scattered throughout the basement, his body had been discovered seated upright against the far wall, still wearing his heavy winter coat. The back of his skull showed the distinctive depression pattern of a ball-peen hammer, delivered from behind while the victim was distracted. Kate Bender served as bait and distraction. Neighbors described her as unusually attractive for a frontier wife. Dark hair, bright eyes, quick with jokes and frontier gossip. She would engage travelers in conversation while they ate, asking about their destinations, their cargo, their expected arrival times in the next town. Information that would determine whether anyone might come looking if they failed to appear. From the personal journal of merchant Thomas Hartwell, found among court records, Mrs. Bender inquired most particularly about my business in Detroit. Seemed overly interested in my timeline. Something unsettling in her manner, though I cannot place what. Hartwell never made it to Detroit. His remains were identified by the distinctive brass buttons on his coat, found buried beneath the Bender's vegetable garden. The family worked with brutal efficiency. John Bender handled the actual killing his blacksmith's arms, strong enough to crush a skull with a single blow. William and Sarah managed disposal, dragging bodies to the basement, where they systematically stripped anything of value before dismembering the remains. Kate maintained the facade, greeting new guests as if nothing had happened, preparing meals over the same fire where they burned evidence of their crimes. But the true genius of their operation lay in the timing. The Benders never killed during busy travel seasons when multiple groups might arrive simultaneously. They avoided taking victims during severe weather when searches would be organized quickly. They targeted isolated travelers, men traveling alone or in pairs, people whose disappearance wouldn't trigger immediate investigation. By 1847, local merchants had begun noticing patterns. Expected deliveries never arrived. Regular customers missed their seasonal appointments. The postmaster in Traverse City reported an unusual number of letters addressed to men who seemed to have vanished between the Northern Territories and Lower Michigan. Yet no one connected these disappearances to the quiet German family running a modest inn on the Grand Traverse Trail. How does an entire community ignore 17 murders happening in their midst? How do neighbors explain away the smell, the missing travelers, the sudden wealth of a family that claimed to earn their living from cornbread and hospitality? The answer lay not in blindness, but in willful ignorance. And the evidence of that complicity was about to emerge from the same flooded basement that had revealed the Bender family's darkest secrets. The church bell rang 13 times on Sunday morning, May 16, 1847. One extra toll that Reverend Samuel Morrison claimed was an accident, though congregation members would later swear it sounded deliberate, mournful, like a confession finally breaking free. In the pews below, 7 families shifted uncomfortably, knowing they had questions to answer about their neighbor's bloody harvest. This wasn't just about a family of killers operating in isolation. This was about an entire community that had chosen profit over conscience, convenience over justice. Blacksmith Henry Mueller was the first to crack under Sheriff Martinez's questioning. His shop sat just 200 yards from the Bender farmhouse, close enough to hear the sounds that came after dark: the scraping of shovels against frozen ground, the creak of cellar doors opening at strange hours, the smell of lime being scattered to mask decay. "I heard things," Mueller admitted, on May 18th, his massive hands trembling as he signed his statement. Sounds that didn't match what farming should sound like. But John Bender paid his bills in gold coin when most folks barely had silver. Good customers are hard to find. The gold told its own story. Local merchants had grown accustomed to the Bender family's unusual wealth. They purchased expensive tools, fine fabric, imported whiskey luxuries that seemed impossible for simple innkeepers to afford. But in a frontier economy where currency was scarce and barter was common, few people questioned the source of ready cash. From the Traverse City Bank records, April 3, 1847, J. Bender deposited 12 gold eagles, mint condition. Customer claimed inheritance from deceased relative in Ohio. No documentation required per territorial banking regulations. Those 12 gold eagles belonged to surveyor Marcus Webb, who'd vanished in March while mapping township boundaries near Grand Traverse Bay. His government salary was paid exclusively in newly minted gold, easily traced to specific federal payrolls. Yet Bank President William Carson had accepted Bender's explanation without investigation, more concerned with increasing deposits than examining their source. The complicity ran deeper than simple greed. Dr. Abraham Colfax had treated Kate Bender for what she described as nervous spells throughout the winter of 1846. Her symptoms, nightmares, trembling hands, episodes of hysteria suggested psychological trauma consistent with witnessing or participating in extreme violence. But Colfax prescribed laudanum and asked no questions about the cause of her distress. Medical confidentiality, he explained when Martinez pressed him for details. A physician cannot betray patient trust, even under these circumstances. Yet Colfax had prescribed enough laudanum to sedate a dozen patients, quantities that suggested the Bender family was using the drug to incapacitate victims before killing them, turning medical treatment into an accessory to murder. The general store owner, Isaac Hoffman, had sold the Benders an unusual quantity of lime over the past 3 years, nearly 2 tons, far more than any legitimate farming operation would require. Lime served one primary purpose in frontier households: neutralizing the smell of decomposition. But Hoffman had never questioned why a family of 4 needed industrial quantities of a substance typically used by undertakers. What would you have done? Hearing strange sounds from your neighbor's property? Seeing them spend money they couldn't have earned honestly? Watching travelers disappear along a route you knew they traveled regularly? Would you have investigated, or would you have chosen the comfortable blindness that let 17 people die? The Methodist Church records revealed the most damning evidence of community complicity. Reverend Morrison had delivered sermons throughout 1846 about turning away from our neighbor's sins and the wisdom of minding our own earthly business, themes that suggested he knew exactly what sins his congregation was choosing to ignore. Evil needs witnesses to thrive. The flood that exposed the Bender family's crimes had also washed away the community's carefully constructed ignorance, and what emerged from that moral basement would prove even more disturbing than the bones themselves. The trapdoor beneath the dining room table opened with a whisper-quiet hinge, engineered by John Bender's blacksmith skills to swing soundlessly on well-oiled pivots. Below, a 10-foot drop onto sharpened stakes waited for any guest unfortunate enough to sit in the designated chair, positioned precisely where Kate served her largest portions and strongest whiskey. This wasn't the work of desperate criminals. This was a killing machine, designed by craftsmen who understood that murder, like any other trade, improved with proper tools and technique. Sheriff Martinez's investigation revealed the mechanical precision behind the Bender operation. The farmhouse had been modified specifically for killing, with alterations that spoke to months of careful planning. The dining room floor showed wear patterns where heavy objects had been dragged repeatedly toward the basement stairs. Grooves carved into the wooden planks created channels that directed blood flow away from the main living areas, keeping the crime scene contained and manageable. Kate's role extended far beyond simple hospitality. She had studied her victims with the attention to detail of a natural predator, categorizing travelers by their potential value and vulnerability. Her personal notebook, recovered from the basement, contained detailed observations written in broken English mixed with German phrases. From Kate Bender's notebook, dated February 9th, 1847, Trader Johnson, gold teeth, heavy purse, talks of wife in Ohio, alone, good weather for traveling, no storm expected. Johnson's gold teeth were found among the skeletal remains, confirming Kate's systematic documentation of victim assets. She had been calculating profit margins on human life with the same attention merchants applied to commodity trading. The basement itself revealed the family's understanding of decomposition science. Bodies were arranged in specific positions to accelerate decay, with lime strategically placed to neutralize odors during the crucial first weeks after death. Ventilation shafts, disguised as root cellar storage, drew air currents that prevented the accumulation of gases that might alert neighbors to the carnage below. William Bender had constructed a series of wooden frames designed to hold bodies upright during the stripping process, allowing for efficient removal of valuable items while keeping blood and other fluids contained. These frames could be disassembled quickly if unexpected visitors arrived, then reassembled once the danger passed. The family's timing showed an understanding of seasonal travel patterns that suggested inside knowledge of territorial commerce. They knew when government surveyors would be traveling with payroll money. They understood the schedules of fur companies moving their annual purchases. They tracked the movement of lumber crews between camps, knowing when men would be carrying their seasonal wages. Sarah Bender maintained detailed maps of local grave sites, marking where they had buried dismembered remains across several square miles of forest. The maps showed a sophisticated understanding of soil conditions, water table depths, and animal behavior patterns that would affect decomposition rates and discovery risks. But perhaps most chilling was the evidence of their learning curve. Early victims showed signs of struggle, inefficient killing methods, hasty disposal. Later murders demonstrated refined techniques, cleaner kills, faster processing, more thorough elimination of evidence. The Bender family had been perfecting their craft, treating mass murder as a skill to be mastered through practice and observation. From the Territorial Marshal's report, May 21, 1847, the systematic nature of these crimes suggests planning and coordination that exceeds typical frontier violence. This family operated as a criminal enterprise with defined roles and proven methods. The marshal's assessment missed the most disturbing aspect of the Bender operation. They hadn't just been killing for money, they had been enjoying it. How do ordinary people transform into efficient killing machines? What psychological mechanisms allow a family to normalize systematic murder as simply another way to make a living? The answer lay buried deeper than the bones in their basement, in a darkness that turned neighbors into accomplices and transformed a farmhouse into America's first documented murder factory. The family photograph, recovered from Kate Bender's dresser drawer, showed 4 people arranged in formal Victorian poses, John's hand resting protectively on his wife's shoulder, William and Sarah standing behind them with the rigid composure expected of frontier settlers. What the camera couldn't capture was that this portrait was taken just 3 days after they had murdered surveyor Marcus Webb, his blood still staining the basement floor beneath their feet. This wasn't a case of gradual moral decay. This was a family unit that had weaponized their most intimate bonds to create the perfect killing machine. Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann, the territorial alienist who examined the crime scene in June of 1847, noted something unprecedented in his experience with criminal psychology. The Benders hadn't just committed murder together. They had developed what he termed collaborative pathology. Each family member's individual darkness amplified and focused by their collective participation. John Bender's role as patriarch and primary killer served a psychological function beyond simple violence. His blacksmith background had conditioned him to see destruction as creation, breaking down raw materials to forge something useful. In his mind, the systematic killing of travelers represented the same process, breaking down human obstacles to create family prosperity. Kate's seductive hospitality masked a predatory intelligence that seemed to derive genuine pleasure from the deception itself. Survivors from nearby settlements described her unusual interest in violent stories, her tendency to linger over descriptions of accidents and deaths, her habit of asking detailed questions about missing persons with what seemed like barely concealed excitement. From Dr. Zimmerman's clinical notes, June 15, 1847, the female subject appears to have experienced genuine arousal from the planning and execution of deceptive murder. Her notebook contains detailed fantasies about future victims, suggesting the killing had become compulsive rather than purely mercenary. William and Sarah Bender represented the most disturbing element of the family dynamic. As the younger generation, they had been raised within this system of normalized murder, never experiencing a moral framework where killing strangers was abnormal or wrong. Their participation wasn't corruption of existing values. It was the natural expression of values they had been taught from childhood. The couple's personal letters, found hidden in the barn, revealed their plans to establish their own family business once they inherited the property. They had been designing improvements to the killing apparatus, discussing more efficient disposal methods, calculating how to expand their operation to handle larger groups of victims simultaneously. The family's religious practices provided another layer of psychological insulation from guilt. They attended Methodist services regularly, contributed to church collections, participated in community prayer meetings. But their private devotions, recorded in John's German-language Bible, revealed a twisted theological framework that justified murder as divine providence. Marginalia in John Bender's Bible, Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 2, God delivers enemies into our hands for destruction. The travelers are sent to us for his purpose. We are his instruments. This wasn't simple criminality. It was a complete moral system that transformed murder into religious duty, family loyalty, and economic necessity. The Benders had created their own isolated universe, where killing strangers was not only acceptable, but praiseworthy. The psychological bonds that enabled their collaboration extended beyond shared guilt into mutual dependence. Each family member possessed crucial skills that the others lacked. Kate's ability to assess and manipulate victims, John's physical strength and mechanical expertise, William's knowledge of local geography and disposal sites, Sarah's bookkeeping skills and financial management. They had become addicted to the act itself, not just the profit, but the power, the deception, the shared secret that separated them from the rest of humanity. Murder had become their family tradition, their unique source of pride and identity. But psychological systems built on shared delusion eventually encounter reality, and the reality approaching the Bender farmhouse would shatter their carefully constructed world in ways they never anticipated. The flood had exposed more than bones. It had revealed the true face of evil, wearing the mask of ordinary family life. The telegram arrived at Sheriff Martinez's office at 2:47 p.m. on May 23, 1847, carrying news that would transform a local murder investigation into a territorial manhunt. Bender family spotted, boarding steamship, Grand Rapids stop, heading north toward Mackinac, stop armed and dangerous stop. This wasn't just about catching killers on the run. This was about preventing a family of practiced murderers from establishing their deadly business in a new hunting ground. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Margaret O'Brien, a laundress working at the Grand Rapids docks, recognized Kate Bender from a wanted poster, despite the woman's attempt to disguise herself with darker hair dye and different clothing. O'Brien had served the Bender family during their travels through Grand Rapids 2 years earlier, remembering Kate's distinctive laugh and her habit of asking unusually detailed questions about other passengers' destinations. She wanted to know who was traveling alone, who had money, who might not be missed if they never reached their destination. O'Brien told federal marshals, "Thought it was just frontier curiosity at the time. Now I understand she was hunting." The steamship manifest revealed the family's new identities: Johann Mueller, his wife Greta, and their adult children Heinrich and Maria. They had purchased first-class passage with gold coins, claiming to be prosperous German immigrants relocating to establish a logging operation near the Straits of Mackinac. The same cover story, the same family structure, the same method of payment that had served them so effectively in Lower Michigan. Federal Marshal James Crawford organized the pursuit with resources unprecedented for territorial law enforcement. The Bender case had attracted attention from Washington, where officials worried about the implications of organized criminal families operating along crucial trade routes. The developing territories couldn't afford to be seen as lawless regions where travelers vanished without consequence. But the Benders had learned from their mistakes in Traverse City. They no longer operated from a fixed location where evidence could accumulate and neighbors could grow suspicious. Instead, they had adopted a nomadic approach, moving between remote settlements, establishing temporary bases, then disappearing before patterns could emerge. From Marshal Crawford's official report, June 2, 1847. Subjects demonstrate sophisticated understanding of territorial law enforcement limitations. They exploit jurisdictional boundaries, communication delays, and limited resources to maintain mobility advantage. The family's new method proved even more difficult to track than their previous operations. Rather than waiting for victims to come to them, they now actively hunted, following trade routes and identifying vulnerable targets through systematic reconnaissance. Kate would pose as a traveling merchant, gathering information about prosperous traders, their schedules, their typical routes. John and William would then ambush selected victims in remote locations, leaving no crime scene for authorities to discover. Sarah maintained detailed records of their movements and profits, treating their nomadic killing spree as a traveling business venture. Her accounting showed they had murdered at least 6 more people during their 3-week flight north, accumulating enough wealth to purchase property and establish operations in a new territory. The psychological pressure of constant movement had begun affecting the family dynamics. Kate's journal entries, recovered after their eventual capture, revealed increasing paranoia and conflict between family members. The collaborative pathology that had made them so effective as stationary killers was breaking down under the stress of life as fugitives. "William grows careless," she wrote on May 28th. "He talks too freely with strangers, drinks too much whiskey, brags about our success." Sarah questions father's decisions openly. "We are becoming dangerous to ourselves." The family's downfall came from their greatest strength, their inability to stop killing. Despite being pursued by federal marshals, despite the risks of continued criminal activity, they couldn't resist the psychological compulsion that had driven their original crimes. Murder had become an addiction they were unable to control, even when survival demanded restraint. The trap that finally caught them was baited with their own insatiable appetite for violence and profit. How does a family that had perfected the art of killing strangers ultimately destroy themselves through the very crimes that had made them successful? The answer waited in the deep forests of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, where the Bender family would face justice that was as brutal and final as the murders they had committed. The campfire crackled against the November darkness on Mackinac Island, casting dancing shadows across 4 faces that had grown gaunt from weeks of running, but their eyes still held the predatory gleam of hunters who couldn't stop hunting. Marshal Crawford and his deputies watched from the tree line, counting heartbeats until they could close the trap on America's most wanted family. This wasn't just the end of a manhunt. This was justice finally catching up to killers who had turned murder into a family legacy, spanning 5 years and at least 23 victims. The Benders had made their final mistake 3 days earlier. Unable to resist the compulsion that had driven their killing spree, they had murdered a French-Canadian trapper named Pierre Dubois just outside the village of Street Ignace. But Dubois wasn't traveling alone. His partner, Henri Fournier, had been scouting ahead and witnessed the attack from a distance. Fournier's description of the killers matched the wanted posters perfectly. 4 people working together with practiced efficiency. The older man striking from behind with a hammer. The woman distracting the victim with conversation. The younger couple efficiently stripping the body of valuables. A family operation that had clearly performed this choreographed murder many times before. The island itself provided the perfect trap. Mackinaw's isolation meant the Benders had nowhere to run once authorities controlled the ferry routes. Winter weather prevented escape by small boat across the dangerous straits. They were cornered on a piece of land barely 8 miles long, with federal marshals, territorial militia, and local volunteers closing in from all sides. From Marshal Crawford's field notes, November 7th, 1847, subjects appear unaware of surrounding forces. Continue normal camping routine, as if still confident in their ability to evade capture. Family dynamics show signs of severe strain under prolonged pursuit stress. The psychological pressure had indeed taken its toll on the family's collaborative pathology. Kate's journal entries from their final weeks revealed paranoid accusations between family members, disputes over money and decision-making, threats of abandonment and betrayal. The bonds that had made them such effective killers were dissolving under the reality of being hunted themselves. John Bender had become increasingly violent toward his own family, applying the same brutal methods he used on victims to maintain discipline within their group. William bore visible injuries from recent beatings. Sarah's writing showed signs of severe emotional distress, with entries becoming increasingly incoherent and desperate. "We are trapped like animals," she wrote on November 4th. "Father speaks of killing us all rather than face capture. Mother laughs at inappropriate times. William drinks constantly. I dream of the faces we destroyed, and they are coming for us." The final confrontation came at dawn on November 8th, when the Benders attempted to steal a fishing boat from the island's harbor. Crawford's forces had been waiting, positioned to intercept any escape attempt. What followed wasn't the dramatic gun battle that newspaper accounts would later describe, but a brief, pathetic struggle as 4 exhausted killers finally faced the consequences of their crimes. John Bender died first, shot while attempting to use Kate as a human shield. His final words, according to multiple witnesses, were not remorse or confession, but curses directed at the neighbors back in Traverse City who had betrayed them by reporting their crimes. Even facing death, he maintained the twisted moral framework that justified their murders. Kate surrendered immediately after John's death, dropping to her knees and claiming she had been forced to participate against her will. But her own notebook, found among their possessions, contained detailed plans for future murders and excited descriptions of past killings that contradicted any claim of reluctant participation. William and Sarah were captured alive, but died in custody before trial. William from alcohol poisoning, Sarah from what the territorial physician described as melancholia and nervous exhaustion. The psychological system that had sustained their collaborative murders couldn't survive the destruction of their family. Structure. The recovery of their possessions revealed the true scope of their crimes. Beyond the gold and valuables taken from known victims, investigators found personal items from dozens of additional murders: pocket watches, rings, letters, photographs of families who would never know what happened to their missing loved ones. Death had finally collected its debt, but even with the Bender family dead, their legacy would continue to haunt the Michigan Territory, raising questions about how many other families might be operating similar killing enterprises in America's remote frontier regions. The basement of the old Bender farmhouse collapsed inward during the winter of 1852, 5 years after the flood that exposed their crimes, as if the earth itself was finally swallowing the evidence of what had happened in that blood-soaked cellar. But the psychological scars left by America's first family of serial killers would prove far more enduring than rotted timbers and crumbling stone foundations. This wasn't just the end of one family's reign of terror. This was the beginning of a fundamental change in how frontier communities understood the monsters that might be living among them. The Bender investigation had revealed uncomfortable truths about frontier society that extended far beyond a single Michigan farmhouse. Federal authorities discovered similar patterns of missing travelers along trade routes throughout the developing territories. Families that had grown mysteriously wealthy while operating remote inns. Communities that had chosen economic convenience over moral responsibility when faced with evidence of systematic murder. Marshall Crawford's final report to Washington cataloged at least 12 other suspected family operations across Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. The Benders hadn't been unique aberrations. They had been part of a broader phenomenon of organized criminal families, exploiting the lawlessness and isolation of America's expanding frontier. From the Congressional Record, February 15, 1848, the territorial system currently provides insufficient law enforcement to protect interstate commerce from organized criminal enterprises. Recent discoveries in Michigan Territory demonstrate the urgent need for federal intervention in frontier justice. The psychological impact on surviving victims' families created lasting trauma that rippled through communities for generations. Children grew up hearing whispered warnings about trusting strangers, about the dangers of traveling alone, about the possibility that anyone might be secretly planning murder. The Bender crimes had shattered the frontier assumption that isolated families were inherently trustworthy simply because they shared the hardships of wilderness life. Dr. Zimmerman's follow-up studies, conducted throughout the 1850s, documented what he termed community pathology, the collective psychological damage inflicted on societies that had enabled or ignored systematic murder. Neighbors who had accepted the Benders' suspicious wealth began questioning their own moral complicity. Church congregations split over debates about collective responsibility and individual guilt. The economic impact proved equally devastating. Traverse City's position as a crucial trade hub never fully recovered from the reputation damage. Traders began avoiding routes that had been associated with the Bender murders, choosing longer but safer paths that bypassed the entire region. Local businesses that had profited from traveler traffic faced bankruptcy as commerce shifted to other territories. But perhaps most disturbing was the evidence that the Bender methodology had influenced other criminal families. Investigators found copies of Kate's notebook in raids on suspected murder operations across the Midwest. Her techniques for victim assessment, her systematic approach to disposal, her psychological manipulation methods, all had been studied and adopted by other families seeking to establish their own killing enterprises. The collaborative pathology that had made the Benders so effective as killers was being replicated by criminal families who saw murder as a viable business model for frontier prosperity. Law enforcement was facing not just individual killers, but entire family systems designed around systematic violence. What transforms ordinary people into efficient killers? How does a family structure that should provide love and support instead create bonds strong enough to sustain years of collaborative murder? The Bender case offered answers that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and family loyalty. The truth was more disturbing than any fiction. Given the right circumstances, the right isolation, the right economic pressures, any family might discover that they were capable of monstrous acts. The Benders weren't born evil, they had learned evil, practiced evil, perfected evil as a family tradition passed down from parents to children like any other inherited skill. Their basement had held more than bones. It had contained evidence that the capacity for systematic murder existed within the most basic unit of human society, waiting for the right conditions to emerge from darkness into deadly action. The dead cannot forgive. Even today, locals in northern Michigan report strange sounds from abandoned farmhouses. The scrape of shovels against frozen ground, the whisper of trapdoors opening, the echo of hammers falling in empty rooms where no one should be working. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.